So today we invite two speakers to present. The first speaker today will be Stephanie Murray. She is working on her PhD at the University of Dayton, and her topic will be discussing insects and how they are colonizing solar rays in Ohio for both areas that are maybe more developed solar panel, but as well as some with prairies underneath it. So let's welcome Stephanie for her presentation.
Okay, great. Can everybody hear me okay? Or should I turn on the mic? Okay, cool, looks like it's good. I'm gonna put my water bottle up here and try not to knock it over. It's very loud if it falls. All right, so thank you, Lisa, for the introduction. Yes, I'm a PhD student at the University of Dayton, and my project is focused around how insects are colonizing a network of solar arrays in Ohio. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to be sharing some data with you. So first, a little introduction. Our country and our world are growing in many ways. So our global population has recently surpassed 8 billion people. And you can see that as that population increases, our greenhouse gas emissions follow. So we're seeing an increase in emissions and subsequent climate change effects. And with that, we're now seeing a growth in renewable energy. So that includes solar power. So the solar power is coming, there's no stopping it. So it's rapidly growing across the United States. This map is actually showing all of the utility scale solar arrays across the country as of 2021. And just for some context, utility scale means it's greater than 1 megawatt, and 1 megawatt can power roughly 172 homes. So as I said, it's rapidly increasing. About 50% of all of the newly proposed utility scale power plants in the US last year were solar power plants. And I just want to point out that this map does include two types of utility scale solar arrays. However, the most prominent type and the type that I study is called photovoltaic or PV. So along with many other states, as you saw, Ohio is undergoing a solar power boom. So we are getting a rapid expansion in solar. Most of our capacity was installed in 2023 last year, and this growth is projected to increase over 9,000 megawatts in the next 5 years. And as is the case with any newly proposed utility scale energy power plant, we just don't know all of the environmental effects yet. So if we want to be ready for those potentially negative effects, we need to study this, we need to figure out what they are. So, for example, with this rapid increase in PV, how is the land development going to affect the environment? So the land is most often totally cleared of vegetation. They spray pesticides, they clear it, and they have to level off the ground. So how does that affect the environment? Also, how do things like fencing around the solar arrays affect habitat fragmentation? And how are wildlife perceiving the panels? So for example, some aquatic insects actually confuse the panels for bodies of water and they lay their eggs on them. So we're trying to be ready for these potentially negative effects. And another thing we need to consider is the land use. So with the increase in PV solar, we're going to be taking up more land. So one thing we can do to combat that is co-locate the solar with other land use purposes. So we could make better use of brownfields, which are just degraded pieces of land, things that are contaminated and maybe not great for food production. So one example here in Dayton is the land where the Sherwin-Williams paint factory burned down in 1987. That land is a little contaminated, we can't grow food on it, so we can maybe put solar on it. We can also co-locate the solar with agricultural purposes, so grazing livestock, or cover crops. This is known as agrivoltaics. And then finally, we can co-locate the solar with ecosystem services. So we could maybe co-locate with flowering pollinator habitat. And this is known as ecovoltaics. So this co-location of solar and native plants is often called a solar prairie. So that's what I'll be referring to as today. And these solar prairies can have native flowers or native grasses. And this is just a creative solution to lowering emissions and also conserving declining insect species, such as native pollinators. So some of you may have heard of the insect apocalypse. So there have been a few scientific studies suggesting global scale insect decline, and because of potential repercussions for humans, a lot of media picked this up, such as the New York Times, The Guardian, and NPR. However, there are not a lot of really great long-term data sets on insect populations. So this is kind of a debated topic in science, but there are many smaller scale studies on regional insect declines or declines in specific groups of insects that are well supported. And those studies are often focused around insect pollinators because they are responsible for about 35% of our world's food production. So they're pretty important. So those pollinators include Hymenoptera, which have our bees and wasps, Lepidoptera, which are our butterflies and moths, Diptera, which are our flies, and John's going to tell us about some cool flies today, and then Coleoptera, which are our beetles. And with all that being said, a lot of these solar arrays in Ohio are leaning into this solar prairie idea now. So solar prairies are often made up of 3 different microhabitats, so smaller habitats within a larger area. So the first would be the buffer zone, which you can see here in A. So this is the area surrounding the entire array, and it's full of taller, sun-loving, flowering plants. And then we have the aisle, which is represented here in B. So this is the area between the solar panels. And it has shorter vegetation that's sometimes more shade tolerant because the panels are shaded with ground. And then we have the area directly under the panels, which is shaded for most of the day, and in some cases doesn't support a lot of plant life. So just to give some visual examples, some of my research sites are doing this, but it's a very new concept. So they're doing it in all different ways. So first we have the solar at University of Dayton. They've seeded with lots of native grasses and flowering plants, and they have a very large flowering buffer zone of native plants. And then we have areas like the village of Minster. So at this site, they're taking advantage of the plants that are already there. So rather than going in and seeding native plants alone, they're just not mowing that buffer area anymore and letting things pop up and grow in. So some of those things are native and some of them are not. And then we have other sites like MEEC, or the Marianas Environmental Education Center. This is at Mount St. John in Beaver Creek. And they are doing a specifically native grass solar prairie. So native grasses, no flowers. And I have some more traditional sites that are focused just on like traditionally manicuring the turf grass that is under and around those panels. So these sites can look very different. So this brings me to the research questions. So today I'm going to focus specifically on insect pollinators. So first I want to know, how does the development of solar affect the insect pollinator community? And how do native flowering seed mixes and microhabitats affect insect pollinator communities? So I'll present data from 7 research sites, and as I just showed you, they all vary a little bit in different ways. And for that first question about solar development, I'm going to zoom in on this site MEEC because I do have data from before and after the solar was installed. So first, to orient you to how I collect these insects. I do collect the insect pollinators using 2 different methods, and unfortunately, we do sacrifice some of the insects that we collect to be able to put them under the microscope, identify them, and properly answer the question. But in the grand scheme of insect populations, the amount that we're collecting is not going to damage the populations. So the methods that we use, first we use pan traps, which you can see in these photos. So these are 3 different colored traps that are painted with UV paint to mimic flowers, and that attracts pollinators. And then we also use sweep nets, which are depicted in these photos. And with this net, we are just physically hitting the vegetation to collect insects that are on that standing plant material. And I will say that when we use sweep nets, we can't physically sweep net under the panels, so we're just looking at the aisles and the buffers. So getting into some of the data for my first question, how does the development affect insect pollinators? So here we are looking at a box plot of the total insect pollinators that were collected in pan traps across various sampling periods at week. So here, early fall of 2022 was before the solar was installed. This red line represents the day the solar was actually turned on. And then we have 3 post-solar sampling periods. So to orient you to the data itself, these whiskers are representing the spread of the data, and this box, these colored boxes are just representing where most of the data lies. So what we see is that insect pollinator abundance that was captured by pan traps specifically was not largely affected by the solar development. So you can see there is quite an increase in summer 2023, that's peak summer. That's to be expected. The temperature is favorable for pollinators. There's lots of flowers out. And when we compare the 2 fall sampling periods before and after solar, the abundance of pollinators is relatively the same. So that's a good thing. And then we can break that data down further to actually look at the composition of the pollinator community, or the ratios of different groups of pollinators to one another. So when we look at this, again, we're seeing that those ratios of pollinators really didn't differ much before or after the solar was installed. So we compare the flies, for example, which was making up a big part of the data. Flies from early fall before solar and early fall after solar. There's not much of a difference. There was a huge increase again in summer, and that's to be expected because of those temperatures and flowers. And then when we look at our bees and wasps, we're generally seeing the same trend. There's perhaps a slight decrease in early fall post-solar, but it was nothing significant. So far looking at the pan trap data, this is a good sign for the pollinators. So now we're shifting to the insect pollinators captured using sweep nets. So the plots are going to be set up the exact same. We're just looking at sweep net data instead of pan traps. So again, the abundance was not largely affected by the solar development. So if we look at fall before solar and fall after, the abundance looks relatively the same. We do see a decrease right after the solar was installed, but we see it jump back up in the summer when those temperatures and flowers are favorable. However, when we look at the breakdown of the sweep net data, the different ratios of pollinator groups from the sweep nets, we do see a difference before and after solar was installed. So again, if we highlight our flies here, we see that overall we have a pretty huge increase in flies, definitely in summer, but even in fall we have a larger proportion of flies compared to other pollinators. And then if we look at our bees and wasps, we're seeing a significant decrease in bees and wasps post-solar in our sweep net data. Now, The important thing to remind you is that Meek is being managed as a native grass solar prairie, not a native flowering solar prairie. So the result we're seeing is not that surprising. So I will say, even though these native grasses are not offering a food source for the pollinators, Meek is a huge proponent of restoring prairie habitat and pollinator habitat. So this pre-solar prairie that you're seeing here still exists entirely surrounding this solar array. So I will say they took a chunk of their land and turned it into solar, but they have a huge pollinator habitat overall at their campus. All right, so summarizing question 1, the insect pollinator community composition might be affected by solar development. So we saw that increase in flies and a decrease in bees and wasps. And this, again, is probably due to the shift in the plants. And this could be a temporary effect as well. We're gonna be following these sites long term. So we'll be collecting more data at this site as well as other sites that are newly developed solar arrays. So now moving on to the second question. How do native flowering seed mixes and various microhabitats affect insect pollinator communities? For this question, I'll be sharing data from all 7 of those sites, but I'm just going to show you some of the highlights of the most interesting things. So here we're looking at 2 plots showing the abundance of bees at solar arrays with and without native flowering seed mixes. So this first plot is showing you that using SweetNet data. So here are our sites with native seed mixes, and you can see there are more bees at the sites with native seed mixes. When we look at those same sites collecting bees and pollinators using our pan traps, we're not seeing the same trend. It's just a different collection method. But overall, we can say maybe we're seeing more bees at solar arrays with native flowering seed mixes. And now we're looking at the abundance of all insect pollinators. So bees, wasps, flies, beetles, butterflies, and moths at various microhabitats in solar arrays. So as a reminder, those microhabitats include a flowering buffer zone, which could have native or non-native flowers, the aisles between the solar panels and the area under the solar panels. So with our SweetNet data, again, we couldn't sweep under the panels, so we're just looking at the aisles compared to the buffers. And we're seeing a significant increase in insect pollinators in the flowering buffer zone. So it seems like the buffers are working. And then looking at our pan trap data here, we have all 3 microhabitats. We're seeing that maybe there are more pollinators in the buffer zone. It's not a significant increase, but there are less under the panels compared to the buffer zone for sure. And this makes sense for several reasons. So the area under the panels is frequently shaded. It's shaded for most or all of the day, depending on the site and the type of solar panels that are there. So it's likely not supporting much plant life. There's usually a lot of bare ground under here. So it's not supporting a lot of flowers. And even if there are flowers under these panels, or if I put my pan traps under these panels, the pollinators that are flying overhead are not seeing that quite as easily. So it makes sense that we're not seeing as many pollinators in that particular microhabitat. So I just want to emphasize that this overall trend that we're seeing for all the pollinators is the same when we break it down and look at the flies. We're seeing more flies in the buffers. It's the same for the beetles. There's a lot more beetles in the buffers. Same trend across the board. And now I want to take a moment to just share some of the awesome native insects that we do see in these flowering solar habitats. So first, looking at Hymenoptera, which are bees and wasps. This is pretty typical for looking at a stalk of goldenrod in one of these habitats. You can see there's a lot going on. We have a sweat bee here. We have a different species of sweat bee here. So those are native solitary bees. We also have a bumblebee over here. We get lots of bumblebees, lots of other native bee species. We see a lot of different types of wasps. Particularly, we see a lot of paper wasps. Some of those are native, some of them are not. They're hard to tell apart. But these paper wasps are here, and they're interestingly taking advantage of the solar panels and actually building their nests on them. And then we also see a lot of carpenter bees. Carpenter bees look very similar to bumblebees. If you want to tell them apart, the carpenter bees are usually bigger and their abdomens are much shinier than the bumblebees. The bumblebees have fuzzy butts and the carpenter bees have shiny butts. Now looking at our Lepidoptera, or our moths and butterflies. We see a lot of different types of butterflies, such as this red admiral here. We see different moths, but particularly we see this webworm moth a lot. And we see different caterpillars as well, including the monarch butterfly caterpillar. And I have not sacrificed any monarch butterfly caterpillars in my sampling. I just want to put that out there. And then our beetles are Coleoptera. So we have some different specialists. So this is a dogbane beetle. It specializes on the dogbane plant. And then this is one of my favorites. This is a locust borer beetle. Specializes on locusts, but it feeds on goldenrod a lot. Those ones are pretty big. They're very beautiful. And we have soldier beetles, which feed on different flowers, and they're very prolific pollinators for that reason. And then a couple of flies. We see a lot of different hoverflies or syrphid flies, and those often mimic bees and wasps. And then a really interesting one I saw over the summer was the clubbed midas fly. This is a pretty big fuzzy fly, and it is an interesting and good pollinator. So to summarize from question 2, the insect pollinators may be more abundant in the native flowering solar prairies, but they're definitely more abundant in the flowering buffer zones. So we saw that trend of more bees in the solar arrays that have native flowering seed mixes, and we saw more insect pollinators in the flowering buffer zones, which had both native and not native plants. So overall, I think we've demonstrated some of the success that solar prairies can have with regard to pollinating insects. So we've definitely shown some potential ways that you can help rehabilitate the communities, even if they are disturbed by the solar development. So you can do that by putting in those flowering buffer zones with any flowers, even if they're not always native. But native flowers are always a good source. So if you can do native, I recommend it. So next steps, I'm going to be following all these sites over time and just watching this community, seeing how it changes. I'll be doing that at all of my sites, including Meek and other solar arrays that are newly developed. So hopefully I'll be able to say more about the diversity of different insect groups at all of these solar arrays. With that, I have lots of people to thank, including my advisor, Dr. Chelsea Prather, all of my lab mates and undergraduate researchers that I could never do these things without. Of course, my partners who allow me to work on their solar arrays. And I can't forget to thank the insects. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions. Yeah?
In the first part of your talk, when you're comparing to pre and post solar installation, are you doing anything to compare to other non-solar plots to look for regional changes or sort of climate changes that may be happening in a larger area?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not doing that in most of my work. I have one site that I kind of got to it after they started construction, and so one of the farmers was very kind and he allowed me to sample in his fields because the area before that was just ag field. So I do have like a reference site of similar land nearby, but for the most part, I just have different sites where I've measured before the solar and then I'll measure after. But there are lots of people working on this, and a lot of them are doing what you suggested. They're looking at like reference areas nearby. Yeah.
I was gonna say, in relation to that, have you measured distance to natural habitat with other native plants, like where those pollinators could be translocated from?
Yeah.
So that you can take that into consideration for the diversity and abundance and all that.
Yeah, I think that's a really important piece to the whole puzzle. There are so many things that go into it, but like, yeah, what kind of habitat is around it? I have one that's near Glen Helen. So yeah, is there like nesting wood around that bees could be using? Are there other flowering habitats? I haven't measured the distance yet, but I could totally do that. And I think it's something I'll have to put into my big data analysis. Yeah.
So when you're separating your pollinators from all the other bugs, like how do you decide what's a pollinator?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, because I have like the flies and the beetles, and not all of them are pollinators. So right now my separation is very rough, and I'm just kind of lumping them all into a group of pollinating or beneficial insects. But I do plan to go in and identify them further so that I can make that distinction. So
I'm curious if the panels, how the temperature on the panels, do they feel hot to the touch? Does that have any bearing on
definitely.
whether things come and go?
they are definitely hot to the touch, and it's interesting, like if I go out in the morning or in the afternoon and it's cooler outside, I'll find a lot of insects hanging out on the panels. A lot of grasshoppers and a lot of praying mantises. And I'm wondering if they're like using that to warm themselves up because the sun is going down. But I've also seen things like stuck and dead to the panels in the middle of the day when it's really hot. So it definitely has an effect. Yeah. Yeah.
Have you seen any evidence that aquatic insects, mayflies for example, are attracted to solar panels and depositing their eggs on them? Is there evidence of that?
Yeah, there definitely is. I did a small study with an undergraduate last summer, and we watched damselflies and dragonflies. We put different types of panels out in an area near water to observe their behavior. So these were just panels that we had like laying around. They weren't on, but we put them out to see the behavior, and we did see a couple of times we saw them laying eggs. Not very often, but we did see that. And then they'll also just like bounce around on it, like how they would over top of water. They'll kind of like skip along the water. We see that behavior as well. But that's when the panels are flat. When they're tilted, which is how they are when they're actually functioning, we don't see the behavior as much. But there's not a lot of work done on that. There needs to be more research. Yeah. Thank you guys.